Welcome to the Behavior Change Architect podcast, a conversation about innovative and evidence-based behavior change strategies designed to increase well-being. Tune in to listen to thought leaders, industry experts, and innovative scientists discuss hot-button topics surrounding specific behaviors, design, and communication strategies. Host Dr. Carrie Evers takes you on a journey to change the discussion, change perspectives, and ultimately help you change behavior for your clients, populations, and perhaps even yourself.
Welcome back to our series on resolutions on the Behavior Change Architect, and this is our second episode in this series. Today we're going to be continuing the conversation with Dr. John Norcross. Dr. Norcross is an internationally recognized authority on behavior change and psychotherapy. And in our previous episode, we focused on talking about New Year's resolutions. And today we're going to switch a little bit and talk about the science behind making resolutions. And I want to welcome Dr. Norcross back to the podcast. Thank you so much for being here with us again.
Oh, it's my pleasure, Carrie.
So you have written a lot of great books, and I highly recommend them, especially for people who are going into psychotherapy or who are interested in clinical practice for psychology. But today I wanted to talk about one book in particular that's related to this topic. Changeology, 5 Steps to Realizing Your Goals and Resolutions. This book starts off with a great description about the science of change that I highly recommend to anyone who would like to take a look at that. So I wanted to start off by asking, how do you see Changeology different than other self-help books?
Well, thanks for those kind words on the book, Carrie. Decades of research validate the methods described in Changeology. That's the crucial difference between it and the morass of other self-help books. I was somewhat ambivalent about writing another self-help books because, in truth, I do deplore the insulting anti-scientific flavor of most self-help books. In fact, a staggering 95% plus of self-help books present no scientific research that they work as self-help. They may have some research that they work when a professional mental health professional provides them, but not as standalone. And as you know, Carrie, our mentor and colleague, Dr. Jim Prochaska, with us have been studying self-change for the past 40 or so years. So Changeology is truly a product of 40 years of scientific research on what works and what doesn't. The other big difference between Changeology and the typical self-help book is that we canvass the entire process of behavior change. Most other self-help books are devoted to a particular topic, like how to combat depression, how to improve a relationship, or they just focus on what you and I would call the action stage. When someone is aware and ready to change their behavior, then that particular self-help book will probably assist you. But as anyone who's tried to change know, we are literally all in different places when it comes to changing our behavior. Some people are unaware of their problem behavior, actively denying it. Some people know it's a problem, they're thinking about it, but aren't ready to go. And still other people are in the action stage, aware and ready to go. And then most people even forget the back end, which we call maintenance. You can change a behavior, but you need to maintain it for the long run. So Changeology, in summary, primarily differs because it is based on the research evidence, 40 years of such, and because it traverses the entire process of behavior change, from soup to nuts, as my brother would say.
That's great. So in part 2 of the book, I was fascinated. You described how to become a changeologist in 90 days. And I'm curious, why the 90 days?
Because that is what the science tells us. You can change a relatively discrete behavior in a week or two, but both neuroscience and behavioral science says it does not become a permanent habitual behavior for about 90 days. You know, the good people at Simon & Schuster and even my book agent kept saying, it'd be a little more popular and sexy if you could just tell people it's a week or two. Well, We can tell people you can change your behavior in a week or two, but it certainly will not become a permanent lifestyle change in a couple weeks. I'm sorry to say, it probably is somewhere between 60 and 90 days.
Wow, so those 7 days to quit a habit might not be the best advice. The 90 days is more appropriate based upon the science. That's good to know.
Yes,
so
and those people relapse at an incredibly high rate. So if you're changing for just 6 or 7 days, then you better be prepared to do that for a couple hundred times in your life. So we just don't want you to get there. We want you to stay there. And that does require, unfortunately, more than a couple weeks.
So it's all about making that change and sustaining the change, which is wonderful based upon the science. So I know the book outlines 5 steps. So I was hoping you could walk people through those 5 steps in terms of what they are and what are your recommendations for each specific step. So can we start with the first step?
You bet. So these are called the 5 Ps, and they are based on the stages of change model, but simplified a little bit. So step 1 is psych, PSYC. That's your motivation. That's getting fired up for the change that's about to come. Step 2 is then prep, as in preparation, where you develop your action plan. You know, it takes more than just the thought and the intention, so step 3 is perspire, when you start doing the hard work of action. But we know, even when you change temporarily, you're going to need to persevere through the obstacles, the slips, the falls. So that step 4 is persevere. And finally, the 5th step, the 5th P, is persist. You need to persist for the long time. So hence you move from psych, prep, perspire, persevere, and persist. And the secret, as you know, Carrie, is not just to know their stages. It's what specifically to do at the right stage.
Now you mentioned they're somewhat related to the stages of change, which is from the trans-theoretical model of behavior change, which you have been cited often and worked with Jim Prochaska and others on developing that. So with these 5 steps, psych, prep, perspire, persevere, and persist, do you have specific tips for people when they find themselves in those different steps?
You bet. And the secret is to do the right thing at the right time. I can't tell you how many of my psychotherapy patients and research participants are doing the right things at the wrong time. So before telling you the correct match, let me just give you some examples of these mismatches, which I find tragic because people are trying to do what they read about, but they're just doing it at the wrong time. So one huge mismatch is when they're getting ready in the psych and prep. They believe that they should listen to some of these other self-help books telling them to do homework assignments and to develop all these skills. But that is way too early in the process. So the early stages are about motivation, getting aroused, getting excited, getting committed, what many people would call the rah, rah, rah. The second mismatch is later when people do need those skills and they're still doing the rah, rah, rah. They're trying to willpower themselves to success when in fact they need the skills of doing something else. So let me now specifically address the question. At psych, we need people to get emotionally aroused and to understand their problem. So in the trans-theoretical model of behavior change, that would be such processes as consciousness raising, emotional arousal. That is when you both know that you should be changing, but also cultivate an emotional push, motivation, and willpower. In step 2, prep, one needs to develop an action plan, to get a support team, to know specifically what you're going to do better and differently to counter the problem. Once in step 3, perspire, then you're going to use those skills. You're going to reward yourself. You're going to receive the support of other people. You're going to rearrange the environment to help you. And finally, you will develop the healthy alternative to your problem. This honestly, Carrie, is where most people fail. So if you're trying to say, be less anxious, they need to develop the healthy opposite of anxiety, which is relaxation or mindfulness. Or if you're trying to stop smoking, the healthy opposite of that is, of course, to stop smoking. But then you have to address, well, how are you going to do the opposite of the anxiety reduction that you typically achieve from smoking? Step 4 and 5 are all about maintaining it, how to bust those slips, how to welcome the slips should they unfortunately occur, and how to keep going for the long term. So I hope it's clear you need to do the right thing at the right time. That's what we call step or stage matching.
Oh, that's wonderful, and such a nice, concise description of each of those 5 steps. I'm curious, how would someone know which step they're in? I think the persevere and persist is clear if you're comparing it to psych, but how would you know if you're in psych versus prep?
Well, they are interrelated and rush back and forth to each other. In the psych, you remain there until you believe that you have sufficient information about yourself and your problem or the goal, that you have achieved sufficient motivation and willpower, so to speak. Of course, most psychologists don't use willpower because it's ill-defined and somewhat elusive, but there's specific indicators. Are you feeling realistically confident? What we shrinks sometimes call genuine self-efficacy that you can do this. So that's more of an emotional and cognitive appraisal of how you're doing. You're in that second step of prep when you know you're ready, but now you have some of the logistics to take care of. You know, if we use the metaphor of a journey, the psych is, do I want to go there? Am I motivated to go there? Am I excited about going there? The second step of prep is when you get the car repaired and you get the trip ticket, or you begin to download information about the actual journey.
Interesting. That's a great description. Thank you. So our last series in this podcast focused on workplace health and well-being. So many of our listeners are individuals who are creating programs for their patients, their populations. They're working with other people, not necessarily doing this for themselves, although it obviously will be important for them as well. So what advice can you give them? How can Changeology help them to develop programs?
Well, in truth, I was skeptical that Changeology, or the trans-theoretical model of behavior change, could be applied to more than addictions. In fact, our colleague Jim Prochaska likes to regale people with a funny story. He said, after the first couple large grants that were largely on smoking, drinking, and addictive behaviors, I was still expressing some skepticism that this idea of stages of change or steps of change could be applied to all disorders. And he said we had to keep proving it to John, and that's why we wrote so many other grants. And it's true. I thought this primarily, if not exclusively, applied to the process of behavior change and addictions. And I was obviously wrong. Changeology and the stages of change have now been applied to 50 or 60 different problems or life goals, and the science works in each case. Of course, the particular techniques you may use will differ problem to problem and goal to goal, but the underlying structure of behavior change is identical. So I'll admit it, I was wrong. And Changeology also applies to population-based interventions. It's not just about individual change, it's about changing organizations. And in fact, there's been a recent spate of applications of the steps or stages of change to accepting vaccines. People go through these same stages. At first, they're unaware or actively deny that the vaccines work. Then they get psyched about it. They gather information. They counter some of their emotional or political defenses against them. They then actually get the vaccine. And now we realize we need to persevere. One shot's not effective long term. We need to persevere and routinely get booster shots. So whether it's vaccines or improving morale, increasing diversity and inclusion in the workplace, behavior change follows the science of behavior change and Changeology.
That's amazing. So it's really not just about health-related behavior change or individual behavior change, but the research has shown that it can be applied to relationship issues and organizational change, sustainability. Is that true?
Exactly true. And in fact, if people simply Google or search stages of change or Changeology or trans-theoretical model, they will find the tens of thousands of articles devoted to this. Just last week, one of my students challenged me about applications of the stages of change in Changeology. I said, well, let's Google it. We did it in a public forum with about 50 people watching. People were just throwing out ideas. The first one was schizophrenia. The second was domestic violence. The next one was workplace morale. And then someone said, how about the vaccine? And boom, there's about 30 written articles, published articles already, on how the stages of change apply to accepting vaccines.
Wow. So it's a constantly evolving, and the behavior change science is just expanding in terms of how it can be used in our daily lives and in so many different fields. And that's one of the things that we're exploring with this podcast. So we're going to have to close out in a second. Are there any last thoughts you wanted to share with our audience, or any last suggestions for them as we hit January and start this year of 2022?
You bet. Don't ditch those resolutions, friends. Expect the occasional slip and respond constructively if you do slip. One of the most frequent questions I'm asked is, well, if I slip, I should give it up? Absolutely not. Get back on that horse immediately. The old saying works. Say it and believe it, friends. A slip is not a fall. Remember that you are succeeding 99% of the time if you just slipped a few times in January. Studies show that if you view the slip as a learning experience and as a natural part of behavior change, you're less likely to relapse. So respond to the slip as you would to other behavioral mistakes in life. Use it as a learning experience. Continue to grow and change.
Wow. Well, thank you so much. And, I wish we had more time because I could talk to you for days. I want to thank my guest, Dr. John Norcross, who is such an incredible advocate for the science of behavior change, and has done so many writings and speaking in terms of how we can apply this to our daily lives. So thank you for being with us here today, Dr. John Norcross.
My pleasure, Carrie. Thank you, and happy resolutions to all.
Thank you so much. Join us for our next episode in the series on resolutions here at the Behavior Change Architect Podcast.
Thank you for listening to the Behavior Change Architect podcast. To continue the conversation, visit our website at www.behaviorchangearchitectpodcast.com, where you can sign up for our newsletter or follow us on your favorite podcast platform.